Okay, so now we're ready to go ahead and assemble the rows. And typically what I'll do is I will sew each row together separately, and then I'll attach row 1 to row 2. And then I usually will attach row 3 to row 4, and finally attach the two separate chunks of rows together, just because the quilt gets kind of heavy. So what you want to do is you want to take your first square and you'll put it face side together with your next one, and just to simply be able to get it off of the floor or wherever you're building this from, I just take a pin and put it in so I know how it's supposed to be assembled. And I'll do the same thing. I'll just roll it down, do face sides together again on the next one, and I'll do the same thing one more time, again just so I know how these are supposed to be assembled. And I'll put roughly, face sides together here and put a pin in it. And that will be very roughly how I am going to put together my first row. Then what I'm going to do is I'll do it more exactly. So I'll take the one that I started with, take out that pin now that I know how it's supposed to go, and I will just simply pin the first two together. And I would make sure, if one has a little bit more complicated a design than the other, that's if it's got some seams in it, in other words, that's the side that I would assume I'm going to sew on. So you can make sure that the seam is sewn in the direction that you want it to go in. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin that. And then I'm going to do this with each of the other squares that I've got for this row. And then I will take it over, so I'm going to pin them all up, and then I will take them over to the sewing machine and start sewing. It actually goes really quickly once you're at that step. So again, not gonna make you sit through all this, but I'm gonna go ahead and pin all of these together, and then I'll meet you over at the sewing machine. All right, thanks. Okay, so now we are ready to start sewing our rows of t-shirt quilt blocks together. This is a pretty easy thing to do, just again, if you just have a minimal amount of sewing experience. One of the things I forgot to mention is that when I assembled my rows with the pins in the previous little piece of video, I actually put a little piece of tape with a number of which row it is on each of the rows, just so that I make sure when I assemble the rows, all 4 of the rows together, I know which one was the top one, which one was the next one, etc. Another thing you can do, which I would strongly advise, is to take a picture of your laid out blocks, just in case you have some sort of a brain cramp or something as you're putting them together and you forget. Some pins fall out and your rows fall apart a little bit, or maybe you've been assembling them up on a quilt wall and something falls off. That way at least you know what the finished quilt was supposed to look like. So I've already done that, obviously, and I have row 1 right here. And again, I've simply pinned the facing sides together, and I'm just going to sew a seam to assemble all these things. And again, another reminder, my recommendation would be if you have a block that is a little bit more complex, so has more seams on it, that is the side that you sew on, so you can make sure that you're catching the seam pressings in the direction that you want them to be pressed down at. So all right, so I'm just simply going to put it in the machine and start sewing my row. Alrighty, so we have our first seam sewn, and you can see now the block is starting to actually even look like something just at this very early stage. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sew all my seams together for all of the blocks in this row, and I'll be back with you soon. So now we have all of the blocks for the first row sewn together, and you can see it's starting to take shape. It's looking kind of cool. So our next step is going to be pressing the seams, and just as in any quilting project, you typically want to press the seams in a single direction as opposed to pressing them open. And it does add a little bit of bulk in that space, or in that area where you have that seam, because then you have like 3 layers of fabric all on top of each other. But I think that the reason we do that, and I could be wrong, this is Pam's theory of why we do this, is when you're joining 2 seams together, say right on top of each other, in quilting, it makes it, if one seam is pressed in one direction and another seam is pressed in another direction, it makes it really easy to join those 2 seams together so that they match and you have a nice clean lines where they're joined. Something else I want to mention is, because I just got to a part of this pressing where this becomes important. If you have a part of your quilt, say this part right here, where I've got several layers right in this area because I've created a larger block from a smaller block. I have multiple seams. So right here I actually have 5 layers of material. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Well, actually I have 4. If I were to press it to the right, in this case, I would actually be adding 2 additional layers, because I'm pressing a press seam on top of a press seam and then adding some other layers, and it's really going to be bulky right there. So I want to make sure when I choose the direction that I press in, that I'm actually pressing to the side that has less layers of fabric. So in other words, this block doesn't have another seam on top of it, whereas this block does. So I'm going to go ahead and press in that direction. Again, we're just trying to keep the bulk as minimal as possible. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and finish pressing the rest of these seams for this piece down, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew together my other 3 rows. And finally, I'll show you how to assemble one row to another row. It's not difficult, but I do want to show you there's a little bit of it's a little tricky when you get when you're trying to line up 2 blocks right on top of each other. And I'll show you a really easy way to do that. Okay, so I think that's it for right this moment, and I will be back with you in just a few seconds. So you put the 2 rows on top of each other, 2 rows that you want to join, and then you can see right here I have a seam pressed in one direction, and then the one that's adjacent to it is pressed in the other direction. And what that allows me to do is basically join the 2 seams up against each other. So buck the 2 seams up against each other, which is going to ultimately create a really nice straight line. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that, and I'm going to I want to go ahead and pin that for this entire first little block here, so that I can show you the benefit, what this is going to look like, why it's so it creates such a nice line to do it this way. And as I'm pinning, let me tell you a little conundrum that you're going to run into. In some cases, if you follow my advice about pressing your seam towards the block that has the least amount of internal seams in it, so the least amount of bulk, sometimes if the one right on top of it will have to be pressed in the same direction, again, if you follow that guidance. So in those cases, you're just going to have to make a choice of the lesser of 2 evils. Either you're going to have a nice, beautiful, straight seam when you join the 2 rows together, or you're going to get a little bit less bulk in that area. Again, this could be something that might be solved if you were decided to press your seams open, as some t-shirt quilters do, but that will create, the drawback of that is that it will be a little bit more difficult to join your 2 rows together and create a perfect line. So I've just pinned this down, and you can see, because I was able to buck those seams up against each other, we have a nice, beautiful, straight line here, which I really like. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and finish pinning this row to the other, and then I'm going to pin rows 3 to row 4, row 3 to row 4, and then I'm going to join the 2, but actually then I'm going to pin them and then I'm going to sew them, of course, and then I'm going to join both sets of rows together, and we will have our completed t-shirt quilt top. So I'll do that now, and I will meet back up with you shortly. Thanks.